Let's talk about asynchronous JavaScript today. For demonstration purposes, we'll be fetching real financial data from the stock market, for example, Apple, Google, and Amazon's price, and also their chart. This is a TradingView widget that we will embed in our page. And the topic of today is of course going to be asynchronous JavaScript. I'll be explaining how the core stack works, how the event loop works, how there is a task queue that will handle the asynchronous promises, and we'll be also learning about the old way that asynchronous functions were handled, like the Callback Hell, and we'll be going to the modern type of function with the try catch and the async await. So with that, let's jump to our project. I do have some styles and an index.html embedded over here. You'll be able to access the source code, so don't worry about that. And we'll be working in the callback script. I'll have a different JS file for each method that we'll be using. We'll also be resolving multiple promises at once. But first, let's have a chat about how JavaScript works, how it executes code, so that you can understand better how the asynchronous functions work. So now I drew this core stack over here. I'll assume that you know some basic JavaScript, you've written some basic JavaScript code, and then you know that JavaScript is a synchronous single-threaded language, so it executes line by line. What I mean by that is that there is a line, there is something that needs to be executed, for example, console logs, and they go into something called a call stack. This is where the tasks are queued up, and for example, there is a console log, it starts at the top of your script, it gets executed, nice. And then it moves on, there is something else, it gets executed, and so on. And this is good, but since this is a single thread, if something was to stall this thread, something that would have to be waited for, then the whole web page would freeze and the user wouldn't be able to interact with it. It would be a pretty bad user experience because he wouldn't know what the hell is going on. So for example, the normal code execution goes, this line gets executed, the second line gets executed, and then JavaScript finds something with an await key. For example, we are fetching financial data from the stock market or whatever data you'd like to fetch, or make a call to a web API. And then what happens now is JavaScript marks this line, this functionality that needs to be awaited, and then it redirects it to something called a task queue. This is where tasks that need a long time to finish will get queued up. For example, it takes this place over here. Then JavaScript will go, skip this line because it's already in the task queue now, and execute the other lines, for example, console logs or any other functionality that don't need fetching in the first place. And then it gets to the end of the call stack. That's great, but then how will our await functionality get executed? The way it will get executed is that there is something called an event loop in JavaScript. It's a pretty bad drawing, but this is going to be our event loop. And what the event loop does is it continuously checks whether the call stack is empty or not. If it is, then it will check whether the task queue is empty or not. If the task queue is not empty, but the call stack is, then it will reach into the task queue. And if there is something that has already resolved here, for example, a promise, which we'll talk about in a minute, then it will put it back into the call stack, and that promise would get executed then. And now that I've mentioned promises, a promise is what you usually await from a fetch from a server. A promise can resolve in two ways. It can either resolve or it can reject. Regardless of which, the event loop will put it back into the call stack, and we have to handle these two scenarios. For example, throw out a message to the user that we successfully fetched the data, or just display the data, or if something went wrong, we display an error message for the user. And in theory, that's about it for asynchronous JavaScript. Now we'll jump into the actual JavaScript and I'll show you the oldest way, which are callbacks, on how to deal with asynchronous operations. And that way you'll have a better understanding of how asynchronous JavaScript works. For this demonstration, I'd like to fetch some stock market data, for example, the price of a stock. For that, let's create a function, because why not? I'd like to encapsulate this data so that we can fetch multiple stock data if I give them the name. This will be the fetch stock data with callback function. This is what I'll call it. And of course, it will receive a stock name, so it knows what to fetch, and then it will receive something called a callback. For now, I won't be doing anything with this function. Let it be like this. And somehow I also want to display this data. So for that, we'll create a helper function. This will be our callback function, by the way, but we'll see it in a minute. This will be display stock data, for example. And this function should receive a data, and it will also receive an error later on. So if an error occurred during our fetch, we will display the error. If we got the data successfully, then we will get the data. All this function is going to do is, if an error is received, it will log an error to the console. Otherwise, it will update one of the elements on our page. And that's all this function is for. Now we have two functions, but how do we combine them so that we actually fetch the data? For that, come back to the fetch stock data with callback. I will put my URL here. This is from FinHub, which provides free API for financial data. You can fetch 60 times per minute. Of course, it will receive the stock in the URL and it will receive the API key. This API key will be regenerated after I end this video, so please don't use it. If you want to follow along, make sure to go to finhub.io and there you can get your own API key set up. And there is a function for fetching data from any web server in JavaScript called fetch. It's quite simple. This is an asynchronous method. This fetch will receive a URL, like where do you want to fetch the data from? It's pretty simple. But then what do I do now? How does this work? Well, if you want to work with callbacks, like they did in the old day, the main thing that you do is that whenever something returns a promise, and by the way, this does return a promise. If you hover over it, you can see over there that this is a promise. Every promise can either resolve or reject, as I already showed you. And if you hit dot after a promise, you'll see that there is the then, the catch, and the finally functions. Let's start with the then function. Call then, and the then function will execute if we successfully fetched the data. If we successfully fetched the data, all I'd like to do is convert this into a JSON format data. Each promise, if it resolved, will give you back a response. And as I said, all I want to do is get the JSON format data, and for that each response can be called with the .json function. It gives you back the data. Then, since the JSON function also returns a promise, I can call either catch finally or then on these objects or these promises as well. So now I'd like to call then again, and this time pass in an arrow function. The then function, the JSON returns a data, so we are able to access the JSON data. And what I'm going to do here is call the callback function. It will be null, as of we didn't get any errors, because then only executes if we didn't get any errors so far. I also pass in the data, just like our display stock data will receive some data to be displayed. So that's it for the then functionality. These will only execute if no errors happened during the process. But how do we handle a scenario where something went wrong and an error occurred? It's pretty simple. That's why there is the catch. The catch function also receives an arrow function, and as a parameter, it will receive something called an error. This will be a type of error message that you get when fetching the data. And if an error occurred during the fetching, I can simply call the callback and pass in the error parameter. And as you can see, there is no await keyword over here. But this is still asynchronous because the then and the catch are built in for the promises, and they will execute depending on how the response is and how we manage to resolve the promise. If it rejected, the catch function will execute. If it succeeded, then these thens will execute. And that's great. We call this magic function called callback. So how do we use these in conjunction? How do we combine these methods? It's going to be pretty simple. I'll call fetch stock data with callback and then pass in a stock symbol. For example, this time we are fetching Apple, and also pass in a function that needs to be executed inside these then and the catch blocks. Lucky for us, this function is exactly with the same parameters and it handles all the scenarios. It can be passed in an error and it can be passed in some data. So I'll simply pass in here the display stock data. And with this, if I change this JS file to be the callbacks.js, I can open this with live server, and there is our data from Apple. As for the little trading view script that we have, this little trading view script is there only for some additional content. You don't have to worry about it because this is an embedded HTML element. This is just another platform where you can visualize financial data, but FinHub is where we get the actual data for our fetching. This is just some addition so that the video may be more enjoyable this way. So if you did not quite get what this methodology does, the callback methodology, don't worry about that. This is the oldest way. But if you encounter code like this, I'd like you to understand it. That's why I wanted to teach it, the basic callback function. So it basically passes in a function which then is capable of handling the error and the data. That's all about it. Next, we'll move on to doing the same thing, but with promises, which is a newer way of handling asynchronous data. It's still not the clearest, but this is also something that you might encounter more frequently. The structure is going to remain the same. We have fetch stock data with promises function that receives only a stock name, so the stock symbol, which is Apple. It has the basic URL because it's needed to fetch from FinHub, and then we call the function. But what do we do inside it? What we do inside it is pretty much the same as we did with the callbacks. We fetch data from the URL, and then we handle the responses. If we successfully reach the server, then I'd like to get the response and convert it into a JSON data, so response.json, which also returns a promise. So if we successfully converted this into a JSON, then what we do here is pass in an arrow function, and instead of passing in a callback, I deliberately say reach out to the data and do what needs to be done, display it. For example, do it like this, but we don't have the data right now, because the data is what I call what this function will receive. If the JSON data is then converted back, then I display the data over here. And this is just some basic HTML element manipulation, nothing you have to worry about. But what happens if we get an error? Well, if we get an error, then we simply catch it, pass in the error parameter for the arrow function, and then console log out the error that we got. It's pretty simple, but then how is it different from callbacks? Well, first of all, as you see, we don't put in a callback function. This function will directly update our UI. Not only that, but we are also returning whatever is resolved from all these promises over here. I can also console log out this one, console.log fetching data, for example. I will be storing this, whatever is returned in a fetching data, and then let's console log that out. Of course, again, I need to change the script over here to be the promises script. And then come back to our site. The financial data is still getting fetched just like we wanted it to do. Let's see the console. As you can see over here, we logged out a promise because the promise got returned from this fetch functionality. And as you can see, the promise is fulfilled. So we successfully fetched the data. And then you can have a look at the functions of the promise. It's not the best data that you get, but we logged out a promise that's successfully resolved. And if you're wondering what's that finally function that we have over here, finally is just basically execute this no matter what, whether we've encountered an error or whether we've successfully fetched our data, execute whatever is inside this finally function. But it's not much different from actually just writing a console log or whatever code over here after we've successfully executed the await, for example. But this time finally would be needed because we are also returning the promise. Also, how you would go about this is that if we've successfully fetched the data, then we can call the then, catch, or finally blocks on the returned promise, and we can execute depending on whether we fetched the data successfully and whether we should move forward with our code then, or whether we should catch the error outside over here and do something else. That's it for promises. And now we'll move on to the async await. For that, I'll change the script right now to be the async await.js. And now with that done, we have the same function as before, fetch stock data. I can also call this function over here with the stock passed in, the stock symbol. And this also receives the symbol that we'd like to fetch. Nothing new, right? To go about using the async and await keywords, we can simply just call the fetch function and pass in the URL. What we can also do is say await this fetch function, so don't do anything until this fetch is done. But then this doesn't make sense because we are fetching the data, but we are not storing it, we are not doing anything with it. We could also call the then and the catch and the other functions over here, but that's not how we usually do it. How we usually do it is, first of all, I store this in a variable like response, because this returns a response. Whether it did resolve or did not resolve is something we have to handle on our own. For example, to handle whether it resolved or not, we put this in a try catch block. Actually, it's a try catch finally block, just like we would have it in the then catch and finally. And the catch, of course, gets an error object. But what we do here is we try to fetch the data. And if an error occurs inside this try block, then the catch block will execute. So for this, we'll be doing the same as before. We'll also store the data because I'd like to also await the response.json function. So I'd like to await for the JSON function to finish so that we get our data and we can store it. These are already two await keywords that we have here. And note that await will only work if the function is tagged with async. That's very important. If I remove the async from here, then JavaScript will throw me some errors, or the editor will throw me some errors. So it's important for me that I put async before my functions. And then what we do here is display the stock data just like we would anywhere else. So essentially nothing changed too much. It's just that we are using the await keyword now, which is way more readable than if we would do it with the promises or the callback methods, because we read the code and we see that, well, something needs to be awaited. That's okay. And then something else needs to be awaited. And if another developer is reading your code, it's much more simple for them to understand it. And in the end, of course, we can log out some errors if the data didn't fetch. You could also chain up a finally over here and it would execute just like the try block would. So even if we fail or even if we succeed, the finally block will get executed. But this time I can also simply console log out whatever I want here and it will also get executed. It doesn't always make sense to use the finally block, only if otherwise we would return from the function, but we still want to execute something. So with that, our function is done. Now we call the function, fetch stock data, and pass in the stock symbol. Essentially, what we could do is set an interval, for example, 5 seconds, but if you are using, for example, a PAD API, you might not want to do this because it will blow the amount of calls you have or you are paying for. We're setting an interval and we are fetching the stock data every 5 seconds. Now, as I recall, FinHub allows 60 calls per minute, so 1 every second in its free plan. So 5 will do just fine for us. Otherwise, we would run out of calls and we would keep getting errors. Actually, let's also console log out something here that you see that the set interval works. For example, the data.c will do. Let's go back to our website, open up the console. And as you can see, 235 is logged continuously every 5 seconds. There are some other errors I get. As you see, the fetch failed. This is from the TradingView widget. It's not our fetch. It's unfortunate because I'm recording this on the weekend when the stock market is closed. Otherwise, every 5 seconds, the price would be changing and you'd see a different price displayed. Maybe try this when the market is open, or fetch some other type of data and you'll see that it's far more interesting that way. So now let's move on to fetching multiple data at once. For example, I want to get Amazon's, Google's and Apple's stock price at once. How do we handle multiple promises and how do we resolve multiple promises simultaneously? So to start working on resolving multiple promises, call here the Promise.All.js. For now, we have a function which is fetch multiple stock data. We have a constant variable getting the tickers of the stocks that we'd like to fetch, and we're calling the function. We'll be, of course, needing to fetch. We are fetching from the same URL as we did before, but we need to fetch one type of stock at once. And as you can see, I inserted stock here, not stocks on purpose, because what I like to do is store this in a constant variable, const stock promises. This will be the stocks.map, meaning we are going over the stocks that we've received, the array that we've received, and inside that I will return whatever we get back from this fetch. But not only what we get back from this fetch, this will receive the stock as the current iteration that we are going over. For example, it could be Apple, Google or Amazon, which will then get fetched down. I'll also call with the then function, I will convert this into the response.json, just like we did before. So for this demonstration, I'll be using the simple promises, not the async await functionality, because in the end project where we have this dropdown and we fetch when the dropdown changes, we'll be using the sync and await. And then with this done, let's actually console log out whatever we get, just so we see what type of data we get back. Let's open up the console. And what you see is that we get back 3 promises returned from the JSON function that we've called. Remember, we first of all fetched the data and then called the JSON functionality on that. And we returned that with the map function, which returns an array of whatever is returned in each iteration. And what we've returned in each iteration is a promise. So we have an array of promises. Now, how do we go about resolving an array of promises? How we go about it is that I remove this console log from here, and there is something called a promise class. This is or an interface in JavaScript, and it has a function called all, which means resolve all the functions at once. This will receive the stock promises, and from now on this is going to be very simple. If they resolved successfully, then this will return multiple data, because remember, we are actually getting the data in a JSON format, and I also need to call this JSON over here. So it will receive the all data, and I can then loop through this all data object, all data.forEach, pass in an arrow function, and this forEach of course is going to receive the data, and as the forEach, as the built-in function works, it will also receive the index at which current iteration are we at. Inside the forEach, I can store, for example, with the variable named stock. This will store the stocks, index, well, indexed element, and we will simply change the data based on the stock that we fetched. As you can see, I'm displaying the stock name over here, and we are also calling the data.c, which is relevant to the FinHub API that we're using. It's nothing too complicated. Overall, we are just resolving all the data over here, and then if it's successful, we display the data. But what happens if we catch an error? If we catch an error, it's going to be very simple. So what you have to take away from here is that there is this Promise.All that can resolve multiple promises at once. How do we get multiple promises? Where we fetch multiple times with the map function. And then once those promises are stored in this promise array, they are resolved, and we go over the resolved promises and then get the data for each of the promises that we've successfully resolved with the Promise.All. That's all there is to it. Let's test this. Now, if we have a look at our chart, there is the current price of Apple, Google, and Amazon. They are displayed over here. Of course, the trading view widget is not functional with this one. We have the drop down, but we're not really bothered with what the trading view widget shows us. What I wanted to see was these prices displayed over here, because of course these are multiple data that are fetched. Now with that done, let's go back to using the async and await keywords and make this drop down functional. And with that, we'll also wrap up the video, because then I've showed you how the async operations basically work. So let's change this to the dropdown fetch.js file and then enter that. So in this file, of course, you have access to it. I won't really be explaining the update trading view widget, because that's just a function and it's native to trading view. It's just there for visualization purposes, so you don't have to worry about this. This is not the topic of the video. I also just close this up. And then what we'll be working in is an async function with the fetch stock data with promises, but we can also emit this just to be fetch stock data. That's all right for now. This time we are opening with the try catch, because I'd like to store the response that we get from the fetch of the URL. And of course, I don't want the code to skip ahead of this, so I have to await this. And we need to tell the compiler that, hey, this is a function that we should wait for before we continue on with the code. And then I also store the data, which will be yet again await the response.fetch. Considering that the response fetched successfully, or sorry, not the response.fetch, the response.json, and then we can store the data. And considering that we successfully got through the first two and we didn't catch any errors, we will display the stock data. But now let's write the catch block as well. It will receive the error as a parameter. If we got any errors, I will simply console log them out. So far so good. The same thing that we did in our async.js file, but for now we'll also add event listeners so that if the dropdown changes, we refetch the data. That's all there is to it. It's pretty simple. Document.getElementById, and we are looking for the ticker switcher, and we are adding an event listener to this one. I'm looking for the change event. So if the dropdown changes, then I pass in an arrow function to be executed. It will receive the event object as any other event listener would. Let's store whatever we've selected in a constant variable called selected symbol, and it will be equal to the event.target.value. Now all we have to do is update the trading view widget to be the selected symbol, and we'll also fetch the stock data and passing in the selected symbol. With this, the final project should be working. So let's check back and see if it does. If I refresh, the prices get fetched. I can change to Google. The trading view widget fetches as well as the price over here, the Amazon as well. And if you're curious, we can actually have a look at this in the network tab. I'll zoom me out a little bit. If I press Apple now, you see a bunch of data displayed. This is due to the fetching of the trading view widget and from FinHub as well. I can also filter only for the fetch. Let's fetch Google now. Another code from FinHub API is printed. There is also the trading view support call, and then what else? Another trading view call and another one from trading view. So the FinHub is at the top over here at the code. But as you see, the fetch goes out and everything executes in order. So with that, this was it for our asynchronous JavaScript guide. I hope you enjoyed it. I prefer to work with real data, that's why I chose financial data. You could very well practice this on your own with any other type of data if you have a free API for that. I hope it was understandable. If you didn't understand something, comment it down below and we'll be happy to help you out. If you found value in this video and would like to see more, please consider giving us a like, maybe even subscribe. And other than that, I hope to see you in the next one. Happy coding and God bless.